So this is an odd little story that I didn't have the time to fully delve into when it first emerged. At the end of March, Bloomberg's Takashi Mochizuki released an article concluding that the sales of Switch 2 in the US had failed to meet the Nintendo management's high expectations, and so Nintendo planned to make 4 million units in the quarter rather than 6 million units as previously proposed. The discussion about the accuracy of this article or not involved Arlo taking down a video he'd already recorded over claims over its veracity, as well as people recalling that Nintendo had to break their usual code of silence on such matters to specifically shoot down Mochizuki's statements previously. However, as far as I can see, the numbers themselves aren't really all that controversial, and is only in the febrile context of some corners of Nintendo commentary, and given the particular history of the journalist in question, that this has taken on chew jelly-like properties of being able to create fire and ice. I have no way of verifying these specific numbers here, but they seem highly plausible to me. But we can look at the big picture and assess where we are, and that's what I plan to do in this video. In particular, there's one question that seems completely absent from the picture that, to me, puts everything into perspective. First up, though, let's look at the very broad picture. What should Nintendo be selling in terms of Switch 2 about now? Sure, Switch was successful, monstrously successful, but that success didn't hit overnight. Very rarely Nintendo has broken 20 million sales figures in the past. I've shared this graph before of prior fiscal years, and hey, the DS even managed a couple of years topping 30 million sold. It should also be noted that these numbers may be slightly misleading because the various consoles released at different times in their financial years, and several consoles, notably the Wii and Switch, suffered stock shortages early on, which Nintendo has largely managed to damp down with Switch 2. If they expect Switch 2 to have a decently long life, selling 20 million consoles a year would put it on track for absolutely stratospheric success yet again, while 25 million would be numbers so high that I would suggest that they would be unsustainable. Even during the height of the pandemic, those aren't the numbers that the Switch managed very often. I'm sure Nintendo would love to front-load its sales in many respects, but it would possibly be even a counter-indication of their strategy from an investor perspective, suggesting that their small and possibly absent margins on the consoles themselves were not necessary precautions that they needed to take, and that they basically had therefore left money on the table. Realistically, Nintendo want to balance a high velocity of sales with the most cost-effective production processes so that short-term issues with supply chains and cost surges balance out over the long term. And so they have a strong install base for Switch 2, but they also will hope to keep high-margin Switch games selling to people who haven't yet pivoted to the new device. I don't frankly think Nintendo need to sell 20 million a year for their plan to do quite well. I certainly don't think they need to or could sustain 25 million a year at the current pace. So my question is, on what actual planet does anybody think that 6 million consoles produced in a quarter during what is always the quietest part of the year would be a remotely sustainable baseline situation? That's 24 million consoles a year, not counting the fact that you might expect them to boost production into holiday seasons. Now, Nintendo will do stuff at other times of the year to spike sales, of course. They will certainly hope the Mario and Zelda movies will provide spring surges for their titles, and I'm sure new variants of the device will be along to boost the sales of the console over the next year or two. They will likely want to have major titles spiking sales when the time is right, and let's face it, they still have most of their biggest titles still on ice at the present time, so there will be no shortage of those in the coming years. They may also be able to find some wiggle room on prices as time goes by, depending on a great many factors. But fundamentally, from any objective measure, 6 million is a ludicrous baseline number, and 4 million is almost certainly a more realistic, if actually still quite high number, for a standard quarter of the year for a reasonably successful console. Now, obviously, Nintendo would like to maintain high sales rates, and I've talked before about how a lot of their strategy for cost reduction appears to be reliant on the economies of scale of producing so many units, driving down per unit costs, and therefore protecting their margins. That gives them an inbuilt incentive to be more aggressive with their sales, but of course that's not always easy. If they drop the price, it's a Pyrrhic victory for them, and while big games are obviously a dial mover, those major titles do take time. And at least they do take time the way Nintendo works, showing a degree of care over the work that they put out. We also can't rule out that forces beyond Nintendo's control would lead them to throttle back on production anyway. Supply shortages of components, concerns about transportation logistics during a geopolitically turbulent time, or even the need to retool in preparation for a new variant at some of their plants. Also, if they want to make adjustments to their production processes, the better to do it this time of year than in the key holiday window. So while it feels likely to me that this is just a normal right-sizing of the production schedule after the supersonic start to the Switch 2's life, obviously market trends but also supply-side constraints are going to have bearings on what Nintendo are doing. So what can Nintendo leverage then to ameliorate the cost pressures and preserve their margins? Well, we've seen some of these strategies play out in recent months already. Major initiatives to boost the profile of Nintendo and its wares, not least the new movie. High-margin items being promoted alongside their usual content, as we saw with Virtual Boy and the Talking Flower, and now pricing initiatives in the US that provide a soft incentive for digital purchasing where margins are higher. There are levers and Nintendo is pulling those levers, but the question is, will it all make a difference? Ultimately, I think they have the time and they have the options. I'm sure they will have a very large number of major games coming up, and with their film schedule hotting up as well, their visibility will only continue to grow. This isn't the case of Switch in the late 2010s, where the machine had hype, but really had to fight for public recognition. Now, given all the work they're putting in and their strong foundations and the likelihood that major titles are going to start dropping in the next year or two, it's certainly possible that the Switch 2 could cross 20 million sold on a regular basis, but this is usually the kind of thing that you see when a console is ramped up to full speed, and often when price cuts of one form or another, such as cheaper variants, are in play. Switch 2 is incredibly early in its lifespan, and the reason its initial production order was so significant is just that Nintendo knew that there would be that supersonic demand out of the gate, and then they folded right into a holiday season. This is the first time when things have had the chance to cool down. Basically, I just don't know that framing all this as some kind of drastic, shameful cutback is an enormously informative way of looking at it. Even if it's true that it is an adjustment to Nintendo's prior plans, their plans are obviously fluid to the situation on the ground. We know they dialed up their expectations for sales in the second half of last year, so it shouldn't be a shock if they sometimes modulate them down slightly as well. In the scheme of things, Nintendo has a highly successful launch, despite a relatively modest catalogue of AAA scale exclusives, a higher console price than usual even in real terms, and a difficult sales context. Reversion to a more normal production schedule, still on the high end of what we might expect for a new console, feels like the same sort of business as usual model, when you consider how often sequel consoles have failed to outperform their prior successful versions. It's actually a big feather in Nintendo's cap that the Switch 2 is doing as well as it is, given that it's not exactly flush with the top games at the moment. Now, I sometimes like to put things into forecasts in numerical terms, so let's talk out of tramlines first. I'd say 90% Nintendo will sell more than 10 million Switch 2 units in 2026, and 90% they'll sell less than 25 million. In terms of specifics, my central expectation would be somewhere in the middle of this range. I'd guess I'd put the 50% likelihood at between 14 and 18 million units sold in 2026. A decent number consistent with the high-performing consoles with plenty of room for growth as those bigger games start to hit. For those of you who might be interested, the Patreon has plenty of early ad-free and exclusive content over there, and it generally does massively help the channel, so please do consider checking it out. But irrespective, thank you so much for watching all the same, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.